In a German ammunition factory, Klaus Weber appeared to be just another ordinary metallurgy specialist. But for 3 months, every bullet he manufactured was designed to fail at the most critical moment when German soldiers needed their weapons most. Klaus's capture was only a matter of time, and what would happen when he was discovered would shock everyone. But what the Gestapo didn't know was that this quiet metal worker had been waging a secret war that would cripple the Nazi war machine from within. Before we reveal Klaus's incredible story of sabotage and sacrifice, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If stories of hidden resistance heroes grip you the way they grip us, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story will absolutely blow your mind. March 15th, 1945, dawned gray and cold over the Krupp ammunition factory in Essen, Germany. The metallic clang of machinery echoed through the morning air as workers shuffled through the gates. 35-year-old Klaus Weber walked with the same steady pace he had maintained for 8 years, his weathered hands clutching a lunch pail that contained more than just bread and cheese. To his fellow workers, Klaus appeared exactly what his papers claimed: a skilled metalworker devoted to producing ammunition for German forces. His wife Anna and young daughter Greta had been killed in an Allied bombing raid 2 years earlier. What everyone believed was a man broken by grief was actually something far more dangerous. Hidden behind Klaus's unremarkable exterior was something that would have earned him immediate execution if discovered. For the past 3 months, Klaus had been implementing a sabotage operation so sophisticated that even the Reich's best engineers couldn't detect it. Every shell casing he produced contained a microscopic flaw. But the flaws weren't random. They were designed to cause catastrophic weapon failure at the moment German soldiers needed their firearms most. Klaus had learned his techniques not from any resistance manual, but from his father Heinrich. Heinrich was a master metalworker who had taught Klaus that the smallest imperfection in metal could create the greatest consequences. But what Klaus didn't know was that Heinrich had been planning something far more ambitious than individual revenge. The sound of approaching footsteps made Klaus's pulse quicken. What Klaus was about to discover was that his sabotage operation had been more effective than he ever imagined. But first, he had to survive a web of dangers that was closing around him faster than he realized. The morning routine that had protected Klaus for 3 months was about to become his greatest vulnerability. At exactly 700 hours, Klaus took his position at workstation number 47, the same station he had occupied since beginning his systematic campaign of industrial sabotage. His practiced hands moved across the precision machinery with movements honed through years of legitimate metalwork. But every adjustment he made served a dual purpose that would prove devastating to German military effectiveness. The acrid smell of metal shavings filled his nostrils as Klaus worked. Each piece he touched carried the weight of his dead family's memory: Anna's laugh, Greta's tiny hand in his. Both silenced forever by the war machine he was now slowly destroying from within. What Klaus didn't know was that his careful routine had been observed by someone whose suspicions were growing stronger each day. The technique Klaus employed was elegant in its simplicity, but it required extraordinary skill to execute without detection. By introducing microscopic stress fractures into the brass during the forming process, he ensured that shells would appear perfect during quality inspection, but they would fail catastrophically when subjected to the extreme pressures of firing. The metal would rupture, jamming weapons and potentially injuring the soldiers attempting to use them. Klaus was operating under pressures that would have broken most men: the constant fear of discovery, the technical precision required for undetectable sabotage, and the weight of knowing that thousands of lives depended on his continued success. But Klaus wasn't working alone, and what he didn't know about his allies would change everything. Hidden throughout the factory were 7 other workers who had been recruited by Klaus's father Heinrich months before Klaus even knew about the resistance network. Each worker had been carefully selected for their technical skills, their moral courage, and their ability to maintain perfect cover while systematically weakening German war production. But what Klaus was about to discover would make him question everything he thought he knew about his father's plan. Heinrich Weber had spent 2 years building this network, using counter-surveillance techniques he had learned during the Great War. But the network's existence was about to be tested in ways none of them had anticipated. The sound of jackboots on concrete made Klaus's blood run cold. Obergefreiter Hans Muller, the Nazi Party representative assigned to monitor factory productivity, had been watching Klaus's workstation with increasing attention for the past week. Muller was not an engineer, but he possessed the kind of political paranoia that made him dangerous to anyone whose loyalty might be questioned. His daily reports to the Gestapo had begun including subtle questions about certain workers whose productivity seemed inconsistent with their apparent dedication to the Reich. But what Muller had observed went beyond simple productivity variations. He had noticed microscopic patterns in Klaus's work that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than random quality fluctuations. These observations were about to trigger an investigation that would threaten the entire resistance network. Klaus felt the weight of Muller's stare like a physical presence. Klaus sensed the scrutiny without looking up from his work. After 8 years in the factory, he had developed an acute awareness of when he was being observed. A survival skill that had kept him alive through purges that had claimed other workers suspected of insufficient enthusiasm for the Nazi cause. But Muller's attention represented just one layer of the danger surrounding Klaus's operation. What Klaus didn't know was that his carefully hidden sabotage had already begun affecting German military operations in ways that were bringing deadly attention to his factory. Reports from the Eastern Front were documenting an alarming pattern of weapon failures. Rifles jamming during crucial moments, artillery shells failing to detonate, machine guns suffering catastrophic malfunctions that left entire squads defenseless. But the pattern was too consistent and too widespread to be coincidental. Through the factory's grimy windows, Klaus could see the latest group of Gestapo investigators arriving for their weekly inspection. But today was different. The black cars kept coming. 1, 2, 5, 8 vehicles in total. These weren't the routine security checks that all armament facilities endured. These were specialized examinations led by engineers trained to detect exactly the kind of sabotage Klaus was implementing. The investigators carried equipment capable of detecting stress patterns in metal, equipment that might reveal deliberate weakness, even when visual inspection showed nothing suspicious. Klaus realized that his 3-month operation was entering its most dangerous phase, but he had no idea that the investigators were carrying orders directly from Heinrich Himmler himself. The factory whistle screamed its morning signal. In 30 minutes, Klaus's world was about to explode. At 0830 hours, Klaus's carefully maintained routine was interrupted by an announcement that sent cold fear through every worker in the facility. The factory's speaker system crackled to life with a voice that made grown men tremble. Sturmbannführer Ernst Richter, one of the SS's most feared security investigators, would be conducting personal interviews with selected workers. Richter's reputation preceded him like the stench of death. Workers who entered his interrogation room often didn't emerge unchanged. Some didn't emerge at all. Klaus recognized the name from whispered conversations among workers whose friends had disappeared after similar investigations. But what terrified Klaus most was the realization that Richter's presence meant the investigation had moved beyond routine security checks. Someone suspected that systematic sabotage was occurring within the facility. Klaus's hands trembled as he reached for his tools. In the distance, he could hear Richter's voice beginning the first interrogation. The screaming would start soon. Klaus continued his work with mechanical precision, but his mind was racing through contingency plans he had developed for exactly this scenario. His sabotage operation had been designed to remain undetectable for months. But the increasing scrutiny suggested that someone suspected industrial sabotage was occurring within the facility. The question was whether suspicion had focused on him specifically or remained general. Sweat beaded on Klaus's forehead despite the cold morning air. Every sound seemed amplified. Every glance from a fellow worker felt like potential betrayal. But there was something else Klaus didn't know. Something that would make the next few hours more dangerous than anything he had faced in 8 years of covert resistance. Reports reaching German high command indicated that weapon failures were not random occurrences, but followed patterns that suggested coordinated sabotage across multiple facilities. The systematic nature of the failures had convinced military leadership that resistance networks were operating within Germany's most secure installations. But what Klaus was about to discover would change everything about his understanding of those networks. Klaus became aware of this development when he overheard a conversation between two supervisors. They were discussing production records from his section, trying to understand why ammunition from certain workstations seemed to be performing differently in field tests than quality control predicted. Klaus realized with growing alarm that his sabotage operation was succeeding beyond his expectations. But success was drawing exactly the kind of attention that could prove fatal to everyone involved in the resistance network. The taste of metal filled his mouth. Fear had a flavor, and Klaus was choking on it. What Klaus didn't know was that his father Heinrich had anticipated this moment and prepared contingency plans that would either save the network or ensure that its destruction would deal a final devastating blow to German ammunition production. The danger was about to escalate in ways Klaus couldn't have anticipated. Through the factory floor, Klaus could hear the heavy footsteps of SS investigators moving from station to station. They were getting closer. Each step brought them nearer to his carefully hidden secrets. At precisely 1,000 hours, Klaus noticed unusual activity near the factory's administrative building. Black Mercedes vehicles were arriving in numbers that suggested more than routine inspection. Through conversations with other workers, Klaus learned something that made his blood run cold. Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler himself had ordered a comprehensive investigation into ammunition quality across all German munitions facilities. The investigation wasn't merely administrative. SS technical experts were implementing new testing procedures designed to detect the exact type of sabotage Klaus had been conducting. Every shell casing would be subjected to stress analysis that could reveal microscopic weaknesses invisible to previous quality control measures. But the new procedures would take several hours to implement, hours that Klaus would use to execute the final phase of his father's master plan. Klaus's hands moved automatically while his mind raced. This was it, the moment Heinrich had prepared him for. The moment when careful planning would either save them all or destroy them completely. What Klaus was about to attempt had never been tried before, and if it failed, every resistance member in the factory would die, screaming. Klaus realized that his 3-month operation was about to be exposed unless he could find a way to cover his tracks. But Klaus had been preparing for this possibility since his first day of sabotage work. What he was about to attempt would either save his operation or result in his immediate execution. But it would also accomplish something that could change the course of the war itself. Klaus's father Heinrich had taught him more than just metalworking techniques during those long hours in their family workshop. Heinrich had been a veteran of the Great War who understood that sometimes survival required thinking several moves ahead of your enemies. The techniques Klaus had learned included not just sabotage, but methods for concealing evidence of sabotage, even under the most sophisticated investigation. But Heinrich had also taught Klaus something else: how to turn an investigation into an opportunity for devastating counterattack. Klaus began implementing emergency protocols his father had drilled into him years earlier. By making subtle adjustments to his machinery and work patterns, he could create the appearance that any defects in his ammunition were the result of equipment wear rather than deliberate sabotage. The process required extraordinary precision and nerves of steel. It would take several hours to complete without attracting attention, but Klaus was running out of time faster than he realized, and what he was about to discover would force him to make the most dangerous decision of his life. In his peripheral vision, Klaus saw something that made his heart stop. Muller was walking directly toward his workstation, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. Sturmbannführer Richter had begun his interviews with workers from Klaus's section. The questions being asked suggested that suspicion was narrowing toward specific individuals. Klaus could hear fragments of interrogation through the factory's thin walls. The screams started exactly as Klaus had predicted. The tone was becoming increasingly aggressive as investigators failed to identify the source of the sabotage they were certain was occurring. But Klaus had one advantage that Richter didn't know about. His father, Heinrich, had infiltrated the factory's administrative system months earlier, providing Klaus with advance warning about which workers would be questioned and what evidence the investigators were seeking. Klaus made a decision that would determine whether his operation could continue or whether he would face immediate arrest. He began implementing a deception his father had designed for exactly this situation, a technique that would make his sabotage appear to be the result of systemic problems rather than individual action. But the deception required Klaus to take risks that could expose him to even greater danger. What Klaus didn't know was that he was about to discover something that would change everything about his understanding of the war and his role in it. The factory lights flickered. In that moment of darkness, Klaus saw movement that shouldn't have been there. At 1200 hours, while Klaus was carefully implementing his cover-up procedures, a message arrived at the factory that would transform the investigation entirely. German forces on the Eastern Front had suffered a catastrophic defeat, partly attributed to massive ammunition failures during a crucial engagement with advancing Soviet forces. Thousands of German soldiers had found their weapons inoperable at the moment they needed them most. The failure led to a collapse that allowed Soviet forces to advance 20 kilometers in a single day, capturing strategic positions that had been considered impregnable. The message contained specific details about the ammunition failures, details that matched exactly the type of sabotage Klaus had been implementing. His microscopic stress fractures had performed precisely as intended, causing weapon failures that contributed to one of Germany's most significant military disasters in months. Klaus realized that his quiet sabotage operation had achieved strategic impact beyond anything he had dared hope for. But success brought dangers Klaus hadn't anticipated, and revelations that would change everything about his mission. The sound of rapid footsteps echoed through the factory. Someone was running, someone was panicking, and that someone was about to lead the investigators straight to Klaus. Reichsfuhrer Himmler's response to the military disaster was swift and brutal. Every worker in Klaus's factory would be subjected to intensive interrogation using methods that had broken far stronger men than Klaus. The investigation would continue until the saboteurs were identified and executed, regardless of how long the process took or how many innocent workers were arrested in the process. But Klaus discovered something that changed his entire understanding of the resistance network he had believed he was part of. Hidden within the administrative message was coded information that revealed the true scope of his father's operation. Heinrich Weber had not just recruited 7 workers at Klaus's facility. He had established sabotage networks in over 30 German ammunition factories across the Reich. Klaus was not an isolated saboteur, but part of a coordinated resistance operation that was systematically crippling German military production. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Klaus understood that his carefully planned operation had reached its endgame. He could continue his sabotage for perhaps another week before the new security measures made his work impossible. Or he could attempt to escape the facility before Richter's investigation identified him. But Heinrich's coded message revealed a third option, one that would require Klaus to sacrifice everything but would deal a blow to German ammunition production that could change the outcome of the war. Klaus read the message again. The final words made his blood freeze. When the wolf howls at midnight, the pack must hunt as one. It was the activation code for Operation Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, Heinrich's final plan. Neither option offered strong prospects for survival. But Klaus had one final card to play that his father had prepared him for since childhood. Heinrich had taught Klaus techniques that went beyond simple sabotage. What Klaus was about to attempt would either destroy the factory's entire production capability or result in his immediate death. But it would also send a message that even the Reich's most secure facilities were vulnerable to those willing to sacrifice everything for resistance. Klaus began implementing the final phase of his operation, a comprehensive sabotage technique that would take several hours to complete, but would cripple ammunition production for months. The technique required Klaus to access areas of the factory normally restricted to supervisors using knowledge of the facility's layout that he had gained through years of careful observation. But Klaus was about to discover that someone else had been watching him with equal care and attention to detail. The sound of boots on metal stairs told Klaus everything he needed to know. They were coming for him. Now. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine whether Heinrich's network lived or died. Obergefreiter Muller had been documenting Klaus's movements and work patterns for weeks, building a case that Klaus's productivity variations suggested possible sabotage activity. Muller's reports had been the primary evidence that brought Sturmbannführer Richter to the facility. Muller was determined to prove his suspicions correct regardless of the consequences for Klaus or his family. But Muller had made a critical error in his surveillance. He had focused so intently on Klaus that he had failed to notice the other members of Heinrich's network who were implementing their own final operations throughout the facility. As Klaus began moving through restricted areas of the factory, implementing his final sabotage operation, Muller was coordinating with security personnel to trap him in the act. The trap was designed to catch Klaus with evidence of sabotage that would justify immediate execution, eliminating any possibility that he could escape or destroy evidence of his activities. But the trap was about to become something entirely different. Klaus sensed the trap closing around him, but his operation was too far advanced to abort without exposing everything he had accomplished over the previous 3 months. He made the decision to complete his sabotage mission regardless of personal consequences, knowing that success would cripple German ammunition production for the remainder of the war. The first explosion came from Sector 7, then Sector 12. Klaus smiled grimly. His father's network was activating exactly as planned. What happened next would be remembered by the few survivors as the most spectacular act of industrial sabotage in Nazi Germany's history, and Vernichtungsfechter Air Richter to the facility. Muller was determined to prove his suspicions correct regardless of the consequences for Klaus or his family. But Muller had made a critical error in his surveillance. He had focused so intently on Klaus that he had failed to notice the other members of Heinrich's network who were implementing their own final operations throughout the facility. As Klaus began moving through restricted areas of the factory, implementing his final sabotage operation, Muller was coordinating with security personnel to trap him in the act. The trap was designed to catch Klaus with evidence of sabotage that would justify immediate execution, eliminating any possibility that he could escape or destroy evidence of his activities. But the trap was about to become something entirely different. Klaus sensed the trap closing around him, but his operation was too far advanced to abort without exposing everything he had accomplished over the previous 3 months. He made the decision to complete his sabotage mission regardless of personal consequences, knowing that success would cripple German ammunition production for the remainder of the war. What happened next would be remembered by the few survivors as the most spectacular act of industrial sabotage in Nazi Germany's history. At 1500 hours, Klaus activated the culmination of his 3-month operation. Using techniques his father had taught him about controlled demolitions, Klaus had planted microscopic charges throughout the factory's main production machinery over the course of several weeks. The charges were designed to detonate simultaneously, destroying equipment in ways that would appear to be industrial accidents rather than deliberate sabotage. But Klaus's charges were only the beginning of what Heinrich's network had prepared. The explosions began in the main assembly area and spread through the facility with devastating effectiveness. Critical machinery worth millions of Reichsmarks was destroyed in minutes. The specialized equipment could not be replaced for months, given Germany's deteriorating industrial situation and lack of raw materials. But as secondary explosions continued throughout the factory, Klaus realized that his sabotage had triggered something far more comprehensive than anything he had planned. Heinrich's other operatives had been waiting for Klaus's signal to implement their own final operations. What Klaus had thought was his individual sacrifice was actually the coordinated culmination of a network that had been preparing for this moment for over a year. The sound of collapsing steel filled the air like thunder. Through the smoke and chaos, Klaus could see figures moving with purpose. His father's network was executing their final mission with military precision. Klaus had succeeded in eliminating not just his own production line, but one of the Reich's most important ammunition production facilities. But Klaus's triumph was brief. As explosions continued throughout the factory, Sturmbannführer Richter and his security team cornered Klaus in the facility's main workshop. Klaus was trapped with evidence of sabotage that left no possibility for denial or escape. The game that had lasted 3 months was finally over. But what Klaus revealed under interrogation would shock even his captors and change everything about their understanding of the resistance they were fighting. Richter's questioning was brief and brutal, employing methods that had broken resistance members throughout occupied Europe. But Klaus revealed something that stunned his interrogators. His sabotage operation was far more extensive than they had imagined. Over 3 months, Klaus had sabotaged not just ammunition at his own workstation, but had coordinated with a network of workers throughout the facility to compromise production across multiple departments. But Klaus's revelations went even further than Richter had feared. When Klaus began speaking about his father Heinrich's true role in the resistance, Richter realized the network's scope was beyond anything SS intelligence had suspected. Heinrich had not only taught Klaus sabotage techniques, but had helped him identify and recruit other workers who shared their commitment to resistance. The network had been operating for months, systematically weakening German ammunition production while maintaining perfect cover. Heinrich's sophisticated counter-surveillance methods had kept them undetected until the very moment they chose to reveal themselves. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The scope of the sabotage operation explained why weapon failures had reached catastrophic levels across multiple fronts. Klaus's network had affected not just thousands of rounds, but tens of thousands, contributing to German military defeats that had accelerated the collapse of Nazi resistance throughout Europe. Heinrich Weber's master plan had succeeded beyond even his own expectations. The taste of blood filled Klaus's mouth as Richter's interrogation intensified. But Klaus felt no pain, only satisfaction. Anna and Greta were finally avenged. Klaus Weber was executed by firing squad at dawn on March 16, 1945, along with 7 other members of his sabotage network. His family received notification that he had died in an industrial accident with no mention of his resistance activities or the strategic impact of his sabotage operation. But Klaus's final statement before execution would become legendary among resistance fighters who survived the war. As he faced the firing squad, Klaus declared that every bullet that failed to fire, every weapon that jammed, every artillery shell that failed to detonate represented a small victory for freedom over tyranny. Klaus stated that ordinary workers armed with technical knowledge and moral courage could accomplish what entire armies sometimes could not. They could strike at the heart of evil and weaken it from within. But Klaus's legacy would prove even more significant than his final words suggested. Klaus's network had achieved something remarkable that would not be fully understood until after the war ended. By the time of his execution, their sabotage had contributed to weapon failures that affected multiple German army groups, contributing to defeats that shortened the war by an estimated 2 to 3 months, according to post-war Allied intelligence assessments. The destruction of the Krupp facility eliminated ammunition production that would have supplied German forces for months. Allied intelligence later estimated that Klaus's network had prevented the production of over 2 million artillery shells and small arms rounds that would have been used against Allied troops during the final months of the war. But perhaps more importantly, Klaus's techniques influenced resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. Klaus's sabotage techniques were so sophisticated that German investigators never fully understood how his network had achieved such comprehensive destruction while remaining undetected for months. The methods they used influenced post-war understanding of industrial sabotage and led to security improvements that are still used in sensitive manufacturing facilities today. But perhaps Klaus's greatest achievement was proving that resistance could emerge from the most unexpected places and achieve results that changed the course of history. The morning sun rose over the ruins of the Krupp factory. In the distance, Allied bombers flew toward their targets, carrying ammunition that would never jam because Klaus Weber had made sure the bullets designed to stop them would never fire. Klaus and his network demonstrated that factory workers, using nothing but their daily access to production machinery and their technical knowledge, could inflict strategic damage on one of history's most powerful military machines. They proved that courage and technical skill, when combined with careful planning and moral conviction, could overcome even the most sophisticated security systems. Klaus Weber died believing that his sacrifice had contributed to Allied victory, but he never knew the full extent of his impact on the war's outcome. His story remained classified for decades, known only to intelligence analysts who studied his techniques and resistance historians who documented the underground war against Nazi Germany. But Klaus's legacy lived on in the knowledge that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to accept evil as inevitable. Sometimes the greatest acts of resistance come from those who appear most ordinary, who use their daily work as a weapon against tyranny, and who sacrifice everything for principles larger than their own survival. Klaus Weber and his network proved that a small group of determined individuals with technical knowledge and unwavering courage could cripple even the Reich's most secure military installations. Their legacy lives on not in monuments or official recognition, but in the knowledge that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept evil as inevitable and are willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of freedom. Klaus Weber's story deserves to be remembered as a moment when technical expertise, moral courage, and coordinated resistance changed the course of history and proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is the quiet determination of ordinary people who refuse to surrender their humanity. Here at Untold Legend Stories, we bring you incredible tales of unsung heroes every single day. These are the stories that deserve remembering, moments that changed history but were never properly documented. People who made a difference when it mattered most, but never received the recognition they earned. If Klaus Weber's story moved you the way it moved us when we discovered this incredible tale of resistance, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. Because tomorrow, we have another extraordinary story of courage and sacrifice you absolutely won't want to miss. Hit that like button if this story showed you something you never knew before. And tell us in the comments what other untold stories of resistance and courage you'd like us to explore next.